Welcome, everybody, to the first ever live recording with a live audience of What on Earth is Going On. I trained this audience to clap right before, so they did a really good job. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you for taking the time to listen. Just to note before we start that we're on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. It's an honor to be on their territory, and we're grateful for the opportunity to do this. So this podcast, it's about 40 episodes in now, and this is the first ever time we've done a panel just like this. The topic at hand is live performance in the digital age. Those are all key words, and I think you're going to find that in the coming discussion of how important each of those words are and in what we're going to talk about. The only other thing I wanted to mention was this episode will come out in a couple weeks. Go to wogopodcast.com. That's WOEGO podcast.com. And there you can find all previous episodes as well as this one, hopefully exactly as we have it tonight. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction of all of these guys. And before I do, I just wanted to mention that these introductions are like snippets of these guys' amazing careers. I'm really honored to share the stage with you. I had to take your bios off of the website and cut them down to a tiny fraction of what they are. And as in doing so, I realized how poorly qualified I am to talk to you guys, even in being in the same room as you guys. So Colleen Renihan is assistant professor and Queen's National Scholar in music, theater, and opera at the Dan School. Her current research focuses on the 20th and 21st centuries and considers aspects of opera and operatic culture from a postmodern perspective. She also tackles issues of cultural politics, performance, temporality, memory, the intersection of opera and media, primarily film, the crossover between popular music and opera, and the implications of the current debates in the philosophy of history on reading operatic performance. Let's give it up for Colleen Renihan. Craig Walker is director of the Dan School and professor of drama and is also cross-appointed to the departments of English and Cultural Studies. Craig has worked as a professional actor, director, and writer, and from 1997 to 2007, he was artistic director of Theatre Kingston, during which time his company produced 54 plays, 36 of which were Canadian, including 18 world premieres. He is a corresponding scholar at the Shaw Festival and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Craig Walker. And Michael Wheeler is the artistic director of Spider Web Show Performance, Canada's first live digital performance company, as well as adjunct instructor at the Dan School. He has previously worked at Generator, the Free Fall Festival with the Theatre Centre, Hatch Emerging Artist Projects with the Harbourfront Centre, and the Shaw Festival. Michael is co-curator of Fold A, the Festival of Live Digital Art, and in March he will direct the world premiere of Behaviour at the Great Canadian Theatre Company in Ottawa. That's Michael Wheeler. So guys, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Colleen, are you ready for the first question?
I don't know.
So Colleen and I chatted just briefly right before about what this first question is and why we ask it. It's what on earth is going on? This is the title of the show. We always ask this first question. It's deliberately broad for a deliberately broad answer. So Colleen, what on earth is going on?
This is a really tricky question. I think there's too much going on, I think is my answer to that. And I feel sometimes, combing through my Twitter feed and my Facebook feed or whatnot, I feel always pulled in a million directions when I immerse myself in those things. And I feel like we live in a culture now where we are all pulled in a million directions, and that we all feel overwhelmed through because of social media, because of the nature of what's happening in the news.
Mm-hmm.
There's too much going on. Yeah,
That's a good answer.
I'll leave it at that.
Craig, what on earth is going on?
Okay, so I took this question pretty seriously. To answer this, I was trying to put everything that I've been thinking into one narrative, and to do it, I think I'd like to go back and revive a theory that is really out of fashion from a guy named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And Chardin came up with a theory of evolution that suggested that, and we're going back 500,000 years at the beginning. He spoke of the geosphere, before there's any sort of life on Earth, and then the biosphere, where Earth is kind of covered with life, and then what he called the noosphere. And the noosphere is when Earth becomes sort of covered by human activity and what is generated by human minds. And we now live our lives almost entirely in the noosphere. And by that I don't mean simply that it's very difficult to get away from seeing something that is constructed by human beings almost anywhere you go. So you're seeing everywhere you go a kind of a reflection of human beings, but also we have words for everything. It's all coded, right? So that we receive a lot of our experience of the world through those codes. So what is of interest to me is that increasingly people speak as if that's all there is the codes. It's just what human beings have made up, that there's nothing else. It was an idea that was really popularized by you could call them post-Saussurians, post-structuralists, postmodernists, and you think about Derrida's idea that there is nothing outside the text. And quite correctly, some people have remarked, if there's only what human beings have made up, then anything goes. There's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as reality, and it's all this sort of Nietzschean power struggle to assert your version of the truth. And that's been a popular idea in the academy for a long time, but recently it's been elected to public office. And Donald Trump is sort of the embodiment of that form of thinking. So you can see there's a kind of a danger to this. But what I would have to say is that it's nonsense, and I could give you a philosophic explanation for that, but I don't think I need to. If you take a stone axe and chop off your own foot, you'll know very quickly that you're still living in the geosphere and the biosphere as well as the noosphere. And the point is that all our ideas, all of our symbols are grounded in the real world. We might feel that we've left a reality behind and it's not relevant, and you can actually go for quite a long way generating thinking about that, but it's just not true. And so my sense is that looking at digital and live performance in that context brings an important meaning to it.
Craig, I'm both deeply ecstatic and deeply disappointed that Donald Trump came up in the first few minutes of this conversation. Ecstatic because, his election does really get to the nub of a lot of what on earth is going on, and I think through what you said, it's a real and present danger, but he also sucks up the oxygen in every room. Live performance in the digital age, and yet we still have to talk about Donald Trump, right? And it's unfortunately true, but also it's fun because it is a part of our zeitgeist. Michael, what on earth is going on?
You know what I find very interesting about this question is it brings me back to my introduction to digital and theater, where I had a theater company called Praxis Theater for 10 years in Toronto. And we had, I think, the first blog. We started in 2006 in Toronto. And what made it popular in the beginning was we did a series called 10 Questions. And we would send these 10 questions to theater artists and they would respond. And basically that was like how we generated our first content. And the first question was always, what the fuck is going on? So I understand why we would start like this. And I bring that up because I think it's relevant to this conversation about how the internet has democratized conversation. Because I think that the addition of fuck was big. Because you could only really read about theater in like the Star or the Globe or maybe Now Magazine. But nobody was kind of using the F word to talk about culture. And so that kind of put our conversation placed it in a different paradigm. So just to say, giving that freedom to people to kind of communicate that way is, I think, partially a product of the self-publishing revolution that digital has empowered. My actual answer to your question is, I think I would like to respond with the social movements that are important right now. So I'll say truth and reconciliation, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, climate change.
Michael, I'm both deeply ecstatic and deeply disappointed that you used fuck in the first 5 minutes of this discussion. Those are all really wonderful answers and starting points for us. I want to take a step back from all of that and ask, what is this term that we're talking about tonight, live performance? We're talking about all of the aspects of that. So before we get into even the digital age, whatever that is, what is live performance? Who wants to take a hack at that? Michael?
Oh, I feel the professors might have a more substantial answer to that. Certainly I find myself and Spiderweb shows continually wrestling with the idea of liveness and how liveness is changing right now, because theater for a long time was defined as something that could that basically had to happen in a room like the one we're in today, where other people are in the room and you see other people do something, and so that's a live event that you attend. And certainly what digital technology is doing to liveness is changing that. We see, holograms are performing, concerts. I think, a famous example is one of the candidates for French president used he gave a speech in Paris, and his hologram gave the same speech live in Marseille. And so what is liveness? You don't have to be in the same room now to see a live speech. And so that's kind of where we're kind of really thinking a lot at Spiderweb Show about liveness, because kind of some of the core precepts that have always applied to liveness are melting.
Colleen, if we were to, just the four of us, sit here without an audience, maybe even without a recording, could this be considered performance, or does performance require an audience to be present?
Well, I don't know. I think you're right about the melting boundaries, and I think that Spiderweb Show is doing some really exciting work in that respect. But I think, a lot of theories of liveness are premised on the idea that there is something special that happens in an event where people are gathered together. So there's a kind of community aspect of it. I'm thinking of Jill Dolan's, what does she call it? The utopian performative, where it's all about the community that's engendered in that moment of performance. And my favorite thing about that piece is where she says that we together confront our mortality together. And what is it that unites us, right? On a more fundamental level than our mortality, right? And that in live performance, that's what we get. And when we enter into the realm of mediated performance, we lose some of that. We lose the confrontation with mortality that we have in a live event or situation.
What is it about performance in this communal event, which can also feel very private? If I'm sitting in an audience and it's blacked out and I'm watching a show, it's not all that different from watching a TV show or a movie. So what is it about this communal space that brings us into contact with mortality, bigger philosophical questions, even dangerous and subversive questions? I mean, and this is for anybody really, but what is it about this space, the active performance, that brings us closer to those things, or does it?
I mean, there are things about I'm thinking about these theories that fetishize the liveness or the ephemeral nature of performance, that it disappears immediately, and it's something that we can't, hold on to. Right. And I think that in mediatizing or recording performance, sometimes it removes that element of its special, fleeting, quality.
Right.
So maybe that's part of it. And I know in opera studies, we're, obsessed with this idea that things can go wrong at any moment, and that's, someone's voice can break, or like the tenor won't hit the high C, and that's awesome when you're live, because when you're watching a video of it, that's not going to happen.
I think this is something that Peggy Fallon talked about how it's the ephemerality of theater and performance and opera, the live art, that something can go wrong and that it cannot be perfectly recorded. Yep. This is being recorded for a podcast now. However, there are things happening in this room that no recording or no video recording can ever properly capture. The breathing in the room, the sense of community that we're all feeling. And I think what Peggy Fallon was trying to say is that it makes live performance unique. But I know, Colleen, you've talked about this, that in our age of highly mediatized and mediated performance, where everything is coming at you through a filter, we have to ask the question again, does it still qualify? Is it still doing the same thing? Craig, what do you think?
I try to resist getting too mystical about live performance, and there are a lot of sort of mystic sounding ideas about it. But I think at a very basic level, there's something about that's very valuable about sharing the same space with other people that's related to, I think everybody knows that with babies, they talk about flesh contact, sort of actual bodily contact. And I think one of the reasons for that is it's important from the time that we're born to feel that we're part of a community. And then they also talk about the very old. One of the most traumatic things for the very old is that they don't get touched. Nobody touches them anymore, And there's that sense that you're no longer part of this continuum. And somehow, I know with the live performance, I'm not going out and touching the audience, of course, but or rarely. But there's still, I think, something about knowing that you're sitting in the audience as part of a community that has chosen to watch this show and to participate in it and to allow it to happen. And just the fact of your presence in the same space, if you didn't want it to happen, you could disrupt it easily. You could do something quite different. You can ruin a live show very easily. So it's also through your will that it happens. And I think that communalizing aspect remains a very important part of live performance. But it is true what Michael said, that you look at the old definitions. Peter Brooks said that theater is what happens when when one person watches another person walk through an empty space, and in there you get the performer, the spectator, and the space. And then the other thing that I would add is time. They have to be there at the same time. But we're now calling things live that aren't live in that sense. You aren't in the same space. We have these live broadcasts from the National Theatre. Well, somehow it's not live in that sense that we spoke of it. It's not live in that sense of sharing the same space with other people. But we can't tear the word away. People do recognize it as a live performance that's broadcast.
Well, and it's difficult too, because a lot of this is on a spectrum of truth, whether it's the post-truth spectrum or simply at what point does something become live, at what point does it become non-mediated. And in our world today, so much of what we experience is mediated through a phone, through social media. Even in this space today, we're mediated through cultural references, the clothing that we're wearing, the way that we speak, the way that we comb and do our hair, all of those things. And I think Spider Web Show, Michael, has a really interesting, I don't know if it's an answer or just a response to all of these things. And I remember one of the videos I watched of you speaking was you answered the question of where did Spider Web Show come from? And it was to answer the dramaturgical question of what is the state of Canadian theatre today? And often Spider Web Show's response to that question is you can do things that are on that spectrum of liveness, and they can be highly mediated because everything is mediated. And therefore, if I have a holographic representation of something, there is still a sense of liveness to it. There's still a sense of performativity. So Michael, can you talk a little bit about that and just what it means to be living in this digital age and doing performance in it? And well, there's so many already questions up in the air, but.
Yeah, just to kind of respond to this conversation specifically, one thing that we're doing with Spiderweb Show is that we have this co-production with GCTC of Behavior that's going on in Ottawa in March. And one of the things we're going to do is a 3-camera live stream of one performance only. And part of that performance, or the context of that, is that it won't exist on the internet past that. So you have to watch it that night, and you have to watch it live, and there won't be an archive of it. So it's still mediated, but it doesn't exist in perpetuity like a film will. And there's a lot of interest, I think, from presenters in general about different modes of presentation of live performance that don't require physical presence. And so for me, I think there's a real question about separating the concepts of physical presence and liveness, just as different things, and that physical presence is not a prerequisite to liveness, I guess. A really interesting example for this conversation is a new piece that Jordan Tannehill, the theater artist, has created that exists entirely within virtual reality, but has a live performer within it. And so they're using motion capture suits to house those actors. I think they have 2 actors, and the actor will do 3 goes at it, and then the other actor subs in. So when you go into a virtual reality environment, you have a live experience where you can interact with another human, but neither of you are occupying the same physical space. And so that's where we're at in terms of what we're talking about right now.
So were you going to say something?
That's fascinating. Yeah, and it makes me think that, one of the reasons that I started thinking deeply about this question of the juxtaposition of the live and the digital was through operas that stage this very juxtaposition. So there's one realm where characters are not are in a virtual realm, and then there's another realm within the same piece in which they're in the so-called real realm. And then I started thinking of Nico Muley's opera Two Boys from 2011, and the British composer Orlando Gough's opera Imago, and they do sort of the same thing with this juxtaposition of the spheres of the virtual and the real. And we like to think about these realms as existing in opposition to one another often. Like that's kind of what these theories of, like you were saying, the mystical ideas about live performance are sort of poised to do. And we think, well, I do believe and I love live performance. But what I think that our participation in the digital and our commitment, our sort of buying into these things, and even in our these acts of performance that we do on social media, platforms, that we are more and more, audiences are more and more willing to, to believe in the realness of these realms. So I think instead of placing those two in juxtaposition, what it could mean for live performance is that perhaps audiences are more willing to believe the truth that might exist in live performance. And I've been concerned about this because I've been thinking about American operas specifically that are based on historical events, where of course we are obsessed with finding with a real in that. Like, is there still some connection with the real historical event in these pieces? So I think it's the digital and these kinds of experiments are changing the way in which audiences engage with traditional live performance, maybe we should say. Yeah.
Craig, you seem on the cusp of a thought.
Yeah, that's the impression I try to create. I think that the ways that I have been mostly interested in using digital, I don't think in live performance, I don't think by any means exhaust the possibilities of it, but it's almost always either in an expressionistic way. In other words, I'm trying to use it to convey what's going on inside the characters, to try to make that internal reality real or apprehensible to the audience, or it's to do with manipulating figure and ground, right? If you think about painting, there's sort of the idea that you see the figure and you see the background to it, and you can do an awful lot with that with digital. You can sort of, not only can you change the background of your actors or your figures, you can change it many different times, but you can sort of play with what is background becomes foreground, and what is foreground becomes background. You can get recursion going on, where many images of the person. You can use it in that way, and that to me is really interesting. But in those things, also lie the dangers, right? I've seen a number of shows that involve projections, where the projections steal the performer's mojo, right? They just sort of overwhelm it, and the performers are no longer interesting because what you're seeing projected is just so overpowering. So that I think one has to be sensitive to that aesthetic, right? If you're going to play with those things, it's an incredibly powerful tool, right? It's like picking up when you were, moving when you're used to using a little ball peen hammer and suddenly you're given, I don't know, like a jackhammer or something like that, it will do serious damage to your show if you aren't very careful.
This is such an interesting line of inquiry. You guys have probably heard of the historian Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote the book *Sapiens* and another one called *Homo Deus*. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but it's okay. I'm not going to ask you a question about him. He recently said that sooner or later, probably sooner, companies like Amazon, Apple, are going to come up with algorithms and bots that are so good at being human that not only do they convince us that they're human, but they seem more human than actual human beings. And by that, he meant, I would rather have a conversation with the bot than with my next door neighbor, or frankly anybody, because they're more humane, they're more friendly, they're more sensitive to my feelings, they're programmed to do all of these wonderful things that make me feel good. And then when I have a conversation with like my buddy, it's like, okay, he's an ignoramus, he's a dick, but Amazon is a nice person. Now that seems ridiculous to us maybe today, but it's only a matter of time before artificial intelligence overtakes the human capacity, not just for mathematics and science and design, but empathy perhaps too, or just the sensation of empathy. And you're probably wondering where I'm going with this. What I'm trying to get to is that there's a question at play here about live performance in the digital age, and what does live performance do best? Live performance has probably been around in human history for the entirety of human history. We've been performing for each other and singing songs for each other for a very, very long time, as far back as we can tell. Not only why we did that is important, but the way in which we did it. Theater today, for example, can feel indistinguishable from Greek drama 2,500 years ago. The four of us on stage take these headphones away, keep everything else in place. It's kind of indistinguishable. Four people having a conversation in front of an audience. The question is, and this is maybe a little bit simplistic for all that we've already talked about, should theater and performance and art and music be the oasis from technology? So your phone, put your phone away when you go to the theater. Put your camera away when you go to the opera. Should it be an oasis from that? Or should artists of performance art, live performance, embrace technology and incorporate it into it? The projections and the music and Facebook and Instagram and whatever. Evan Mitchell, who's the conductor of the Kingston Symphony, asks people to bring their phones and look at them in the performance, and they can actually, on the app that he gives them, they can actually follow along with what the music is doing and where the music is coming from. Very interesting idea, but there's a lot of people, and Evan will tell you this, who are totally against it because it's against the oasis that this space provides. So I know that that's a very simplistic question, and I'm not looking for simplistic answers, but what do you guys think of this debate, this tension here?
Oh, me. I have this one.
Yes, I know, Michael. Go for it.
So I have a theory that speaks to some of the concerns about this. And it's not that complicated, actually. And the theory is that there's a new design department in performance. So, electricity came along, we got lighting design and sound design, and then, video stuff came along. So video design's a department now. And what I propose is that with the internet, there's a new department called social design. And that is a department that you can incorporate from the very beginning of a creative process and consider from an artistic perspective whether or not the insertion of some sort of digital interactive tool is going to serve the work artistically or work against it. And consider that in the whole the same way you would consider what is the set going to be and how are the lights going to work and all of those other things that a creative team thinks about when they're making a live performance. And sometimes, just like you might have no music in a show, social design is not going to serve the work, and don't use it. But at this point, where everyone's walking around with this thing in their pocket that is letting them be interactive, and almost every other entertainment, like if I go to the basketball game, they're definitely going to ask me to tweet for my all-star selections, or if I'm using if I want to listen to music, now it's streaming and I'm creating playlists. This interactivity that's inherent in the internet, there has to be room made for it in live performance, and it has to, or it doesn't have to, but I feel like it's strongest when the decision about when and how to use it is rooted in an artistic context.
Right.
Yeah, I guess what I would add to that is that if you're using that stuff, you need to think about it a little bit from the McLuhan-esque point of view, right? The idea that the medium that you're using has content and has implications in itself. So I think one wants to be aware of those and not reckless of those, and not imagine that you can use that medium, the digital medium, in whatever form, regardless of what it's implying. But I do think there's a place for it because it is so much a part of our experience, a part of who we are. Each and every one of us has been digitized. When you're on the internet and an ad comes up that is directed to you, that's because you have been turned into a series of numbers based on your activity and your preferences, and and that is a digital proxy for you and your personality, and that's happened to every one of us. And then, of course, we each have a little computer in our pocket. I put mine down, I turned it off, but we each have that little computer in our pocket, which is an extension of our memory and our thought and our knowledge, but also we're penetrated by that world, the noosphere, in ourselves. It's a two-directional thing, and that has changed us. There was this idea that in the Enlightenment that if we all had lived in a world of infinite information, human beings would be infinitely improvable. We would achieve perfection because of access to all the knowledge, all the information. But what actually seems to be the case with our access to complete information is that we get to choose what we prefer to hear more and more. So instead of it being this dream of perfectibility, it's this nightmare of confirmation bias that we get and that. So that is now part of our identity. That's something that we now know about ourselves, right? That people didn't even talk about confirmation bias very much at all before the arrival of the internet, but it's taught us something about ourselves, and it's a part of our personalities. So when you digitize a performance, when you bring that into it, you're speaking to that. I don't want to exaggerate by saying the cyborg part of our personality, but the digitized part of our identity and thought, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the pithy phrase that I like to use about this is it's the journey from monologue to dialogue. So, not that long ago, kind of how we received everything was one-way communication. The movies came at us, the newspapers comes at you, the radio comes at you, and you accept it as a passive receiver. And now almost everything we have has some sort of ability for us to interact. You can leave a comment, you can give 5 stars, you can like, you can share, you can retweet. And so there's a new expectation, especially amongst younger people who have no other experience of media, that what entertainment or art involves hearing from them as well. And so I think that's a big shift. And I think that personally, I think the theater has suffered from not embracing that at all. And as an art form is one of the latest adopters. Music, because of kind of what Napster did, kind of blew up that whole model, and so they had to adapt a lot earlier. But there's still obviously a lot of resistance, is this oasis that you mentioned earlier. But I don't see how that kind of perspective will be embraced by new audiences.
Well, and it's almost a fait accompli, right? Jen Stevenson, who works in the Dance School of Drama and Music, where we are now, has talked about how that when it comes to live performance, you can't really know the difference between liveness and realness, right? And that there's a moment at which, when you're on your phone, it merges with the whole thing. That the technology becomes the mediated experience, right? And for her research, which is theater of the real, and sort of documentary drama, which is taking nonfiction and putting it on stage, there's a sense that the more you encounter live performance, even if it's fictional and imaginary, the more you have to be comfortable with the unknown. And there's a certain sense with all of this that that the digitization of theater or live performance is the unknown. We don't know where it's going to go. We don't know if I look at my phone in the audience and it goes off at some point. We don't know how we're going to interact with that. We don't know how it's going to screw things up or make things better. And Colleen, I know you've talked about how there's this growing line of mediation over the last century or so of art. So in film, we first started watching film as spectacle. Mm-hmm. And then we started to appreciate it for providing a continued narrative. Mm-hmm. And then we applied that to television. We apply that, of course, to theater. Almost all theater now gives us a story, a narrative, in a very traditional way, but something that we can follow from beginning to end. But one thing you say also is that digital tools allow us to actually approach dangerous, subversive subjects. That the many-to-many communications of the internet, of social media, allow us actually, give us the freedom maybe, the comfort to deal with difficult subjects. Can you, maybe I'm not even correct in saying that, but can you elaborate on that a bit?
I think that it's true that we can understand this, these most recent, iterations of the digital, kind of in the same way as television and film kind of created a new frame through which we could see the live, or through which we needed to question it. But I also would say that, and I'm curious to know what you think, that this is we've now moved into an even more heightened version of that. This is not necessarily just the next step in that evolution, that there is now, the slipperiness between, right, live and digital, and Jen, talks about these things, Jen Stevenson talks about these things as well, that, there is some real gray area, when we talk about live performance, especially autobiography or theater of the real, right? And my own interest in historically based live performance or performance, that the slippery edges between real and unreal. I think it's like we've taken a leap even further away from that. So it's not necessarily. It is a lineage, I suppose, or kind of like a progression through television and film, but that this is. But I also think, in response to your previous question, that's not necessarily, for me at least, productive to see them always in juxtaposition, and that these questions that we've been interested in asking of theater, these beautiful questions about our confrontation of mortality, we can continue to ask in the context of these new forms, and in fact they become maybe even in some cases even more interesting. Like Maria Callas, for example, is touring right now in hologram form, mm-hmm. and she's live there. And so we confront our mortality and her mortality, like in a really interesting ways when we are there and in the presence of that kind of presence, So the questions, I don't think we're leaving behind all of these these ways of engaging with theater, but it sort of tweaks the questions that we've been asking of performance in some, I think, really exciting ways and really productive, fascinating ways.
Does live performance, and for that matter art, have a duty to be dangerous, to subvert? And if it does it have a duty to subvert the very technology through which it is mediated?
I wouldn't want to go so far as to say that art has a duty to do that. What about somebody who's just playing Mozart sonatas? Right? That's not subversive at all, but it's something that's beautiful and has a value and can be deeply fulfilling. So I wouldn't want to go so far as that. I do think that. Although I've said some of the terrifying things about the digital world, but I don't think that we should shrink from it like Mennonites and as artists and try to move away from it and not engage with the world because it's becoming too overwhelming. I do think we have a duty to engage with that, and I think that there's the part of it that when Colleen's talking about Maria Callas, I find that idea really exciting. What then becomes possible if you aren't limited by history and Maria Callas can be part of your live performance. That's very exciting as an artist, and I think that that's really legitimate. What then you do with it becomes another question, and I guess I would, when I see something that I feel needs criticism or subversion, then I feel that I have a duty as an artist to do that. But I don't always feel that, and I think anybody who says that's all they want to do, that's all they do, I think they're lying. I think that you never sit at home and put on some music on that you find relaxing, or read something simply for the giggles. I don't believe it. I think that we're all much more complicated than that.
Well, and it's also kind of boring too. If that's all there is subversion and danger and I want to go home and put on Netflix if it still exists in this world that needs subversion.
And sometimes uphold certain things, right?
Yeah.
Not everything needs to be subverted.
Right. Michael?
I mean, the one thing that most forms of art do is it's subversive in that it's not a capitalist activity. So the act of doing it isn't really going to contribute to the economy usually. I've never produced a show where box office paid for the play. It's not like a rational activity in a capitalist marketplace. And so it's kind of just subversive to do it.
Right. The very act of doing it is subversive. But how do we deal with that struggle? I mean, we're dealing with big tech companies, for example, that are hoovering up as much cultural product as they possibly can to feed back to us for a profit. So how do artists handle this question in the digital age when anything that is digitized is potentially being profited by someone else?
Well, I guess my answer would be that one thing that we can do is tame it and make it our own, the way that Michael does. That he takes it and uses it, and he's not really worried about that. There's you think about why is digital appealing, and the two uses of it mainly are that it's transferable, infinitely transferable. You make a recording of something, and aside from the initial loss of fidelity that in making that recording itself, once its numbers, can be replicated infinitely. So that is available in a capitalist world, and they're going to make money from it. The other part of it is that it's manipulable, right? You can, once you've got that sequence of numbers, you can change it, you can edit it, you can transform it, you can, change pitch with auto-tune, you can change color, you can manipulate it in any way. And that's kind of a fantastic, exciting tool. And again, the capitalists are going to make use of it, and that they do make use of it is a good explanation for why popular music, the top 30, really is pretty lousy now, and but it's also there for us to use. And I don't think that the mere fact that that I do the last show that I did in here used projections, and we didn't shy away from using the digital in that. I don't feel like I'm suddenly becoming a lackey to capitalism because I'm using digital technology. I think rather it's a tool that I get to use as well. That it's a great democratizer in that way, right? It's available for all of us.
I mean, that's the democratization, I think, is a really interesting point for. There's a lot of bad things the internet has done, but one of the positives is this ability for everyone to express themselves. There was a lot of gateways to someone just writing some words that other people could read in a way that doesn't exist anymore. Anyone can have a blog, anyone can write a Facebook post. The democratization of our ability to express ourselves, I think, is a real positive, just because, all humans are creative beings and should have a right to express themselves. I have real concerns about the internet companies. Just to share an internal struggle currently, I have this idea to do FOLDA, our Festival of Live Digital Art, and not use Facebook at all, because I have the concerns that so many of us have about Facebook's conduct. And we can't. like I also need people to come to the festival. And so like I have like this long-term plan about like how could we promote a festival without using Facebook, but it's a really tricky, thorny issue. And I think there's kind of like monopolies right now going on that like remind me of like stories of the United States with the railroad and like people only owning like 4 things, and like because you don't really have a choice. Like I can't opt out of Facebook and run a theater festival. Basically, is what I'm saying.
Well, and it's interesting because 15 years ago, the question would be, how do I promote this using Facebook? And that would be like, I can't. No one knew how because Facebook was obviously just brand new. And now we've moved to a world in which it's impossible not to use these tools. And it only begs the question, though, I mean, where will we be in 15 years? What tool will we be using? What technology will we be embracing that we can't think of life without it? And which leads to the other question, which is, where will live performance be in 15, 20, 30, 50 years? Not only where do we see things going, but if we fast forward, where could things be if our wildest imaginations of either the oasis of live performance or the merger between that and technology becomes true? Colleen, do you have a...
I mean, I think, again, that my sense is that the boundaries will be even murkier, that this demand for authenticity in live performance will be lessened.
The slipperiness that you talked about earlier.
I think so, yeah. That's my sense, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm clever enough to think about where we'll be in 15 years, but I think maybe 5 or 10, you know. And I think one of the things that I see happening with live performance, well, okay, so as we get more and more into a digitized world, we're more and more in the world of repetition and simulacra, and you know, almost everything is a copy of a copy of a copy. Even, you know, look, going out to the suburbs, and one suburb looks the same as another. Everything, capitalism has done that. Right? It's all franchise places. Every place that you go on Earth is pretty much like every other place, except for very old architecture in some places, right? Everything else is becoming more and more like everything else. However, there's this other thing that's happening in live performance where we're seeing more and more immersive performances, site-specific performances, and performances where you're interacting with the actors and you play along and you're part of the game and you're involved in it. So I think what inevitably is going to happen is where we'll see a new form of performance is the interaction of that immersive, interactive performance with the with digitization. You know, that will be you'll be going to shows in which you're you know, that the show that was out at Fort Henry. What was it? What was that one called?
I went to it.
Yeah. Lumina Borealis, that's right. Okay, so you basically walked through this environment, and there were a lot of very beautiful things done with lights and sound, and you were in the environment, and that was kind of interesting. But it totally lacked narrative. It lacked. It was sort of spectacle without content. And I thought, well, okay, I guess that's, you know, an interesting project to have there, but I want the content. I want narrative, and I want character, and I want all those other things to be happening. And I think that's where we'll go, that you'll be going in and having an immersive experience, and you'll make discoveries about, you know, what it means to be human, which is, I think, what live performance is supposed to address itself to, but enhanced by the digital experience.
That's a really great example of the Lumina Borealis, because I do think, you know, there's some strengths and weaknesses to it. And what the strength of it for me was that at the very end, you could throw snowballs at different things, and it made this meter go up. And if everybody worked together to throw snowballs at the right things, then like basically this huge video design like blew up. And the reason I say blew up is I brought little kids with me, and they, in the car on the way back, were just talking how about they blew up the wall, and they're very excited about that. And those kids are just going to grow up with that sense, like that's what an entertainment experience is. They don't just go see a thing, but they throw snowballs at a wall until it blows up. And so I think that that's a good clue about kind of where we're going. who knows where we're going, because things are going so many different ways. But one thing that I am clear on is that the creative process is changing. And the way that it's changing is because these technologies are interactive, they don't respond well to what the theater process that we currently exist in are. So right now, we rehearse a play for 3 weeks, we do some previews, and then we reveal, opening night, the critics come and we reveal the product. And if you have interactive technologies that you need audiences to deal with, that can be a huge disaster, because you're essentially revealing and learning what the show is at the same time, which is never a good idea. And so the way that we've tried to respond to that through Folda is that everything we curate is either in alpha or beta or golden. And that's really stealing from how software is developed, because software also has to interact with people. And so I think that we're going to see creative processes that are much more about okay, here's our first shot at what this is. Get some people to interact with it, learn from that, come back, build it again. Okay, now it's this. More people interact with it. Okay, now we think we know what it is. Go into a third process, and that it will be much more of an iterative development process, necessarily because you're not just perfecting what's on the stage, but you're perfecting what that interaction is with the audience.
I'm so interested in this question of interactivity. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a show on Netflix called Black Mirror. Mm-hmm. And they did a movie recently called Bandersnatch, which is an hour and a half long, full, essentially film, but it's a choose-your-own adventure film. And I think they're actually being sued by choose-your-own adventure books. But you will actually decide through Netflix which path you want the character to take. But there's a sense by the end of the film that the choices are kind of illusory, that the character would have ended up in the same place anyways, or in a similar place. But regardless, you were in the hands of the writers the whole time, just like reading a choose-your-own-adventure book, right? And this question of interactivity, I think, gives pressure to live performance, whether or not it does it through the digital realm of being interactive. Because I wonder, a 16-year-old going to the theater today, if it's not interactive, is it interesting? Because everything else in your life is interactive, even if it's just the illusion of interactivity, right? Go ahead, Colleen.
I think that's absolutely true. That this kind of there are, and it's this sort of piecemeal lack of a narrative through many of these, or a different kind of expectation of the audience to provide their own sense of narrative can be really exciting. Like you were talking about, Michael, in your iterations, like the alpha, beta. I think that's exciting too, because you get you feel as an audience member like you're part of the creation of of the piece. But that I was thinking about, I was at a Christmas light show in Edmonton over the holidays, and you were led through this series of beautiful light sculptures, and they were each I realized after the fourth one that they were just photo ops. They were set up so that people could take selfies of themselves in front of these beautiful light sculptures, and that's what everyone was doing. It was oh, this was sort of set up to be a kind of story, but in fact, it was just this opportunity for people to post these pictures. Anyway, it seemed, I was frustrated by that fact, by the kind of reality of this performance that I thought was going to be about something.
Well, isn't that
totally
interesting?
different.
The baggage that we take to something. It's funny, Craig, when you said, what's that show that was on at Fort Henry? And I immediately thought Lumina Borealis, but then I thought, no, that wasn't a show. Mm-hmm. That was a lightscape, right? But then, Michael, when you talked about the interactivity, I realized, no, that was definitely a performative event. Mm-hmm. I may just have been both audience and performer at the same time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One final question before we open it up to the audience for their questions. If what we're talking about, and I'm only asking this because I asked you before to come up with a verb, but it may be different now. If what we're talking about, live performance in the digital age, could be summed up in a verb, what would that verb be? And I'll go first. I think it would be, just because it's coming to me, to slice. I think there's an act of slicing. I think that that there's not only a separation between things, but when you slice something open, you also reveal what's inside. And I think that live performance in the digital age reveals what performance is at its heart in response to that, in response to technology. But that's just my clever, silly word. Who's got a verb to apply?
I was thinking about melting. maybe that live performance is melting in this context of the digital. And I was thinking about it because again, I don't think I resist this juxtaposition of the two, and think that there might be a kind of, there might be a warmth to what's happening and what's emerging and what's what we're going to find as a result of,
like an alchemist making a new metal in a way.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Craig?
I don't know if it makes me an optimist or a pessimist, but my word is persisting.
Cool. Persisting, melting, slicing. Michael?
Democratizing.
Yeah. That's another word that I wish we talked about more. What do you mean by that, democratizing, more than what we said earlier? Like, is it just opening it up to more people, or is it the very process of performance itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm sitting here at someone who teaches at Queen's University because I just started putting my ideas on the internet. And I wonder if I was born in a different era, if I'd be sitting here.
Right.
Yeah.
And that democracy has not just allowed you, but required you to come forward.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to open it up to the audience now for questions. Shalane's got the microphone over there. If you've got a question, just raise your hand. If there aren't any, I've got a lot more. So we got a question over there. Claire.
Is it on?
Claire has 2 questions.
Thanks. Oh, that's really loud. Sorry. Did I just blow your ears off, Colleen? Sorry. First of all, thank you guys. This is like super fascinating. And it's funny because I've been having these conversations outside of this room with friends and just thinking, I'm going to give 2 questions as fast as I can, but I've been thinking back on the last year. I went to 2 live performances. The first one, did anyone see the Fleetwood Mac show in Toronto or Ottawa? Yeah. It was crazy. It was such an experience. Stevie Nicks, her voice has changed a little bit, but barely, but you could tell, and it felt like, talking about the authenticity, it's like they didn't lip sync it. I went to another artist, a Parisian performer, and halfway through my friend leans over and you're like, she's lip syncing, and I was like devastated. And then, I asked the question, do we define live performance based on the quality or the expectation that we go into it, or is it both? So that's my first question. The second question is, I know you guys probably going back to something very social media driven. We live in a digital age where people will pay anything to be part of a live experience. Case in point, the Fire Festival that you're probably familiar with. People will pay up to $240,000 just to have that experience. And so I asked the question, is it a matter of that we want to be associated, or going back to what you were saying, and I really liked, was the idea that it's the process, it's the creative process, that people just want to be part of the hype. So is it that we actually want to enjoy the live performance, or is it this hype that we want to be part of? And Colleen was saying, she was disappointed because it was a marketing tactic, the Christmas, a situation where you're like, I just want to be entertained. I don't actually want to engage. So yeah, I asked, is it just about association, the live performance, or is it actually that genuine moment where we want to be part of something and share that communal thing? So cool. Sorry, those are 2 really long-winded questions.
No, they're great, and I think they're related too. And just to give context for those who don't know, the Fire Festival was done about 1.5 years ago, and it was a huge festival that you paid a fortune to become part of. You went to the Bahamas for a weekend or one of 2 weekends, and it turned out to be a massive fraud. Even though the organizers probably didn't want it to be a fraud, but it was, you were sleeping on soaked mattresses in emergency tents in a place that was just awful, and you got cheese sandwiches when you were promised amazing catering and models to be around all of you, and it was a disaster. And there's a documentary on Netflix and on Hulu, I think, as well, talking about this. But anyways, let's approach that question first about performance as association, I guess. Who wants to take a hit at that?
I feel like that's a marketing question. Like, I'm totally engaged in trying to make sure that people across Canada feel like they're really going to miss out if they don't come to Fulda. we even put out some videos after last Folda just to make sure it looked really awesome. So like just like with the straight up goal of increasing FOMO. And so that for me is a marketing question. But I think really, to jump to your other question, what we really wanted a performance is authenticity. And that comes in lots of different ways, whether you feel the performance is authentic or the way you've been asked to engage with a piece and give feedback on it is authentic. But, you know, we just want to feel like we're not being snowed and that we're having some sort of genuine human experience.
Yeah, which is interesting. You're talking about lip syncing. Yeah, Colleen, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add to that that's so interesting that you've focused in on the voice, because I think there are special quality. There are special. We put particular expectations on the singing voice than we do on other aspects, and it's in fact I'm advising a student thesis on this very topic right now. So in fact, this particular student's going to give a presentation on this. I'm going to give a plug for her. And we have a performing research event at the department next Friday. And she's going to give a summary. But it's, this question of why we expect this authenticity of the voice. And I mean, we see this outcry over Britney Spears, the leaked her leaked vocal line from one of her singles, and people are just can't believe that this is happening, and there are expectations, I think, put on the singing voice in terms of authenticity that we don't put on live performance in other venues or in other modes, and certainly from other instruments if we're talking about in music. And I think that there's lots of reasons for this, but the voice delivers a particular kind of authenticity, and like indexicality. It summons, there's all kinds of interesting writing about opera in particular that summons the material real. There's something physically reverberating that is bodily, and that engages the physical and the real in the present. In ways that other modes of communication or expression, performative expression, that don't do that to the same degree. So, yeah, it's really fascinating how we hear and desire authenticity in the singing voice. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm obsessed with that question too.
Well, and just to jump in there too with the association question, especially with musical events and opera especially. A lot of people go to opera to be seen to have gone to the opera. And I'm talking about traditional classic opera. It's a lot about association. It's a lot about, the fact that I went, the fact that I'm a ticket holder, the fact that I sponsor arts in my community, right? And that's a big part of the question too, I think. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
Hi there. Thanks for your insights, guys. Back at the kind of dawn of the recording era, so when we're looking at the late 1880s, when Edison invented his wax cylinder recording, there was no such thing as a microphone, and in fact the way you had to record was to kind of gather around a large metal cone, which really served well people who were playing in small ensembles and instruments that kind of were snappy. So you could sit around this little metal cone and play the banjo or trumpet or drums, and it worked very well. The recording worked very well. It worked terribly for a symphony orchestra. So it was decades before you were able to kind of achieve decent sounding orchestral recordings. And this, of course, is a time at the turn of the century where this early form of mass marketing or mass media, being able to get recordings out, really meant that what the popular music and the short songs that also would fit on these small recordings became even more popular in a sense. So I guess the question, in your experience, what are the aspects of live performance that are translating very well to the digital age? And maybe what are some of the aspects of live performance that are a bit more of a hiccup, take a little bit more effort, are not working as well, need more of a think around?
Cool. I've only half an hour worth of answers to that question. The two like the good and the bad that I'll give. Well, I think what's really interesting right now is what's going on with pod plays. And there's a lot of work that's being created site-specifically where you travel through a space and you have a narrative, and it speaks to those ideas that Craig's been talking about site-specific work that is digitally amplified, We have one coming at Fulda by Lisa Ravensburg, and it's an Indigenous walking tour of Queens that ends underneath the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, and manages to kind of recontextualize this space that we walk around every day in an Indigenous context, and reopens up the places that we've seen every day. And I think there's a lot of other examples I could give of that type of work, but it certainly is an expanding digital performance strategy, I guess. What I feel like is really not working is live tweeting. I don't really understand like why you would go to see like, I don't know, Three Sisters and be like, oh, now Masha is upset. Like, I just don't understand like what the value of that is. And also just this idea of the screens in front of everyone's faces, like it actually just impedes the audience's experience of it. And so I think, although it was one of the first integrations, I think we're really struggling to understand how it actually improves the kind of the artistic experience.
Yeah, I'm hoping that audiences become more sophisticated about that, and that I agree with you. That's something that digital does very well. That it's, when you read a novel, there's a sense that you're getting a voice that's going straight to the core of you, straight to the core of your imagination, and there's a little bit of that feeling in those shows where there's somebody is a kind of a podcast, and somebody is sort of whispering in your ear as you're going around this environment, and there's that, so it's a sense of that very introverted personal experience while you're in a social environment. And I think that is very interesting, and there's lots to be done with that. But I was telling Ben about this. I went to and I know what a curmudgeon this makes me sound like, but I don't care. I went to a show at the Grad Club, and it was Elliot Brood, and their performance was terrific.
I love Elliot Brood. I miss him.
Yeah, well, but I don't know what you would have thought. Everybody had their goddamn telephones out, right? And either they were filming what was going on, or they were texting one another. They were sort of doing that, and I thought, that is so uncool. And then I thought, well, why do you think it's uncool? And then I thought, well, because in terms of engaging with the thing, and in terms of the interaction part of it, what we're looking for is for you to drop the rest of your world away and engage with them imaginatively what they're doing. And I started thinking about, the example I use is the person I think is the coolest person who ever lives is Miles Davis, and it's one of the things that made him so cool was the sort of release that he embodied in creating in the moment, and everybody wanted to be in the moment with him, wanted to share in that moment, whether you're another musician or an audience, and if you put something between you and Miles, you aren't engaging with them more, you're engaging with them less, right? And I wish, it seemed to me when I saw that was a while ago, and I thought, man, how long is this going to last? And I have to believe that people are going to say, I don't want to do that. I just wasted that experience. I was there, and I used to think that when I was working at Convocations in Toronto as a sort of just an usher. Right? And people would be there, and they'd miss their child's whole convocation because they had a stupid camera at their face, and they were so concerned to not lose a minute for posterity, and they're not going to ever watch it again. I promise you. But they have to possess it. They have to acquire it. It has to be an acquisition. They can't just experience it and move on. And I hope that people drop that with time, that they'll recognize that there are just better things, there are more fulfilling things.
And in a way become more cool with the technology around us.
And
so Craig, I'm very, very sympathetic to your argument, and I am biased towards it. I believe the same things. But to play devil's advocate for a second, for example, memory, right? So we all have these memory prosthetics attached to us, these phones. At any time, we can Google anything we want, and therefore, we don't have to remember anything anymore. So it's not just phone numbers. Nobody remembers phone numbers, but it's everything. Why would you learn about an encyclopedia entry for Apple, for example, like an actual Apple or the company, whatever you want, if at any time you can Google it? And this is subconscious. It means that at any time, why would I bother spending the time to know something when I have this prosthetic, right? But the devil's advocate part of me says, what if the prosthetic becomes just as much a part of you as your arm or your leg? And I hope we don't live in that world, because I don't personally want to, but maybe those guys that were in that Elliot Brood performance were holding their phones as if it were an extension of their person, and to take it away would be like holding one arm behind their back. And I'm not trying to spark an argument because I'm on your side, but I do have to ask the question, are we maybe just old curmudgeons, like you prefaced?
Well, I'm definitely an old curmudgeon, but yeah, I don't.
Colleen, you were going to...
I mean, I feel this as well, but I also, feel like maybe there is a certain kind of creative process also happening when that capturing of of a particular aspect of the performance is also happening. That the sort of authenticity of that original performance is sort of falls away a little bit, and that there is a kind of democratizing aspect to that work, maybe.
Well, and the networking too, if I'm texting people, I'm bringing other people into the experience, even if they're not immediately present.
Yeah, I mean, I love following live tweet. Stuff on Twitter. I'm like, I'm living vicariously when I can't be there.
I mean, the one kind of caveat I would give to the live tweeting comment is I feel like with one-off events, it's much different because it's only happening once and people want to know what's happening at that one time. I just
like
really
with the Chekhov play.
I just question it in the run of a show. It just is challenging to me. But just to get back to that other question, I feel like this the technology is ahead of what society is comfortable with. Google Glass came out 5 years ago. They kind of put it out there. Everybody hated the idea that anyone wearing those glasses could be recording what they're doing. They got called glass holes. People started punching them in the face, and they pulled it. They actually just pulled it right off the market. And now that kind of technology is mostly just being used in industrial context for workers who basically can see more than you would be able to see with your eyes when they're constructing kind of complicated
Stock boy
things.
or something like that. Yeah. Is really useful.
Yeah. But it's just they're just biding their time for us to get more comfortable with the idea.
Right.
It's all ready to go when we're ready to go.
Or for it to be more invisible, like contact lenses. Sorry, Craig, you were gonna.
I mean, if you're using it to get rid of drudgery, the having to in terms of memorizing things, if you're using the technology for that's great. It's just sort of like the Gutenberg press. Think about the drudgery of those monks endlessly copying things out. I mean, would you want them to go on with doing that? No. Just use the damn press and we'll get there faster. So I think that's great if you're eliminating things in order to free yourself for other things. But I think, as Michael said, the technology is ahead of where we are. And whenever any new technology comes along, and I said this to Michael before about the Canadian studio, all people really see in it at first is what they're already doing, right? How can we use this for what we're already doing, enhance it? And it takes the next generation, it takes the younger people who grow up with it to come up with ways of using it that you never imagined, that the inventors never had in mind. And so I guess I would argue that, again, that what I consider a really dumb use of that technology to ruin, maybe you've never had that experience, so you don't think of yourself as ruining something. And as you said, it would be like asking them to take away one of their arms. But I can tell you they aren't using it in a way that's enhancing it.
Right.
I know that. That's just not true. But further on, there might be other things, and there'll be times as people get used to it more and more, when the next generation comes along and they've had cell phones their whole life, sometimes they'll have them in their pockets, and sometimes they'll have them out, and they'll, I hope, use them more judiciously. Not everybody, but most people, I hope.
So to reveal myself as an even bigger curmudgeon than you, Craig, I'm going to play devil's advocate to my devil's advocate and say, I think there's room for boredom and drudgery in life, and I think that actually opens up paths for creativity. I think that if I sit in a play and I'm bored for the first 5 minutes, that might just mean that I haven't caught up with its rhythm yet. It might just mean that I'm not speaking its language yet, and so I don't get it. But 20 minutes later, something clicks. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute, oh my God, this is profound. And that's how the best things that I've seen in my life in terms of live performance were ones that I was bored at the beginning because I wasn't, and this is my fancy justification, because I just hadn't caught up to it yet. And so there is maybe a place for boredom, maybe not drudgery like writing things out page after page, but maybe there's room for just being still for a moment and then allowing technology to enhance that, perhaps. Colleen?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I was thinking of that too when you first posed us these questions, that there are some examples of digital engaging with the live where it is capitalizing on that kind of slow feeling, and also the intimacy, right? The feeling of intimacy, which is I think what people crave anyway, right? So like, for example, this, I'm trying to remember the name of the show with the tents and the...
Oh, good things to do.
Yes, thank you. At Volta last year, which was spectacular. And so, you were asked to enter a space, you completely blind, and you were led to a space that was revealed to be a tent where you were by yourself. And then a computer, someone was communicating with you through a computer.
A very personal letter sort of thing.
Really personal, yeah. And it was, asking you questions of a very personal nature, and you were asked to reflect on these things and drink chamomile tea, and it was like this really slow, personal, quiet experience, which isn't what we associate with the digital realm. It was like fast.
And can almost be an antidote to the instant gratification.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to give it back to the audience because we've taken a long time with your question, sir. It was a good one. Any other questions? Last, we got time for one more. Come on, you guys must have a really interesting question out there.
I can throw.
Oh, there we go. Right over. Sorry, I couldn't see you in the dark.
Hi. You've actually touched on this a little bit already, but I was wondering if maybe the panel could speak to the idea of accessibility. When you were wrapping up your panel discussion, actually, Michael's comments about democracy made me think about this, but I've actually encountered it on two sides. I mean, we have accessibility in the sense of democratizing the experience so that people who maybe can't physically be there or can't temporally be there can participate. But I've also experienced accessibility in terms of barriers, and the fact that a lot of these digitally, and Craig sort of got at this when he was talking about the commercialization and the commodification of art, the idea that you're dealing with something that is perhaps owned, and you can't necessarily get access to it. So for example, in my own research, I have trouble actually getting access to musical scores related to video games because the companies don't want to release that for free. Basically, they don't want to set a precedent of having that material go outside of their ownership, even though this is something that's now perceived as a work of art and not necessarily just a commodity. So I'm wondering if maybe you just want to generally explore the idea of accessibility and maybe what that means in your particular areas.
Accessibility is really at the core of a lot of what Spiderweb Show has tried to achieve with the technologies we've built so far. Craig mentioned briefly CDN Studio, which basically is an application that lets you use your laptop, computer, and a green screen to appear in the same space online. So if you imagine Skype, you're all in different boxes. Imagine you're all in the same box, basically. And the real impetus to that invention, which was created by Sarah Garten-Stanley, was the idea that lots of people can't leave their homes for various different reasons, but perhaps we could start to provide them with tools where they could actually rehearse from their homes. And so I think that the way that time and space is being collapsed by these technologies opens up real opportunities for people who have mobility issues. And then obviously all of the kind of closed captioning kind of opportunities as well in terms of letting more people be able to kind of see or hear or understand what's going on in performance. I actually think that one of the real positives of the digital revolution is the way that it can expand the capacity for people to participate both as creators and as audience makers.
Yeah, I think that there's two things that I think of with regard to accessibility. One of them is that the way that filmmaking has changed, so that if you can afford an iPhone, you can make a film. Right, and it's got to the point like if you had a pencil and paper, you could write a novel. Right, it's that, and when everybody can do it, there's a possibility that it will allow the art to evolve more freely. But at the same time, because of that, what I was saying about the transferability of digital, that you can replicate it over and over and over again. So clearly, that created problems for ownership. It was so easy to go on, just give music away to your friends that you had, that there became a lot of paranoia about that. And I think that the attempts legally to control digital for the sake of capitalism are pretty harsh right now. So you look at one thing against the other, and I don't know where I land on whether it's a net good or bad for accessibility. But
Colleen?
I'm not sure I have anything really enlightening to add to that, but I just know that when Michael mentioned the democratizing aspect of these technologies, it was like, yes, of course, that is one of the most important things about the digital and about the opportunities moving forward, I think, for digital, certainly. And I mean, by contrast, we should then question this, the aura that we are replacing, or insisting should remain around live performance, I think, for that reason, especially.
Yeah, I mean, an idea that it just kind of occurred to me through this conversation is that one of the awesome things about digital in the context of live performance is that overall it's an opportunity to explore how to use these tools in a way that connects to our humanity and who we are and what we could be or what can we achieve, and that is relatively unique because most of these tech companies we're talking about, the reason that they are used is to generate revenue. And so within an artistic context, that's actually possibly the most human way to understand what they can do.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a lot of what you've been doing with there concentrates on the unique moment, unique event, right? Which is the opposite of that. You almost can't sell that.
Yeah,
right?
well, it's
You
not
can't-
that iterative, so it's not very
Yeah.
profitable.
No, and the unique event. I think that's one of the refuges that live performance offers. That we're in this world of endless replication, and to have something that's only happening once feels precious.
Right.
To me.
Back to that ephemerality.
Yeah.
With that, I think that's the end of our discussion and the end of questions. Thank you so much for everyone for being here. Thanks to our panel, of course. Let's have a round of applause for them. They've been excellent.